hear the comment of Dr. Silja Behre, who published her dissertation under the title Bewegte Erinnerung, Deutungskämpfe 1968, in deutsch-französischer Perspektive, Moved Memory, Conflicts of Interpretation about 1968 in German-French Perspective, and she is going to spending the year 2016-2017 as a postdoctoral fellow at the Franz Rosenzweig Center at the Hebrew University, working on the intellectual biography of the German-Israeli scholar Yochanan Bloch. Silja, please.
Thank you very much. I was actually hoping when I came to Israel that I will get rid of the 68ers that I lived so long with to write this book. And they followed me until here, then you left, and I'm actually happy. Thank you very much, Lutz, for your book, and that the New Left continues here tonight. It's okay with the micro? The history of Matzpen seems like it comes from another age, from an era when the compass needle of history indicated clearly to one direction, towards utopia, towards progress, towards the future. Lutz Fiedler's history of Matzpen takes us back to these times, to the 1960s in Israel. It was then that a small group of young Israeli political activists emancipated themselves from the world vision of the Communist Party. Not only were they searching for the revolution beyond the party, but with their critique of Zionism and their vision of the Israeli-Palestinian politics, they also challenged the consensus of the Israeli society. For this reason, they became outcasts and were branded as troublemakers. But outside of Israel, they were given the role of instructors, of masters, and insiders in the matter of the conflict. Despite being a marginal group, the history of Matzpen reflects, as Lutz argues in his book, the core questions of the Israeli and Jewish existence. Starting in the 60s with this group, he aims to write the history of Israel from the margins, claiming that this change in perspective might also provide new questions concerning the Israeli society. Indeed, how does a society cope with cases of fundamental critique of its basis? How did Israel integrate the Matzpen episode into its national history? Did Matzpen become a role model for dissident politics? And in a more global perspective, on the history of protest and dissidence, the following questions are coming up to my mind. How does Matzpen relate to the international protest movements of the 60s? To what extent does this particular case of Israeli dissidents enable us to formulate general questions on the history of the international New Left? I want to elaborate on the idea which guides the book, the idea of looking onto recent contemporary history from the margins. This shift in perspective also leads to a different, as I will argue, a different view on the history of the global protest movements of the 1960s, as well as on their afterlives. In a first step, I want to discuss the main political ideas of Matzpen and the European New Left just briefly. Secondly, I will ask how far the history of Matzpen, as presented here, adds a different view on the historiography of the 60s and 70s protest and revolt, from which the Israeli case of communist dissidents has been left out most of the time. Last but not least, I want to show that the book itself is in various aspects the result of a research from the margins. My first point, inventing the revolution on the periphery. Usually, historians who dedicate their work to the history of protest, dissidents, and the left do not write success stories. Also, the Matzpen activists saw themselves confronted with the aporia of their utopian views, which were rooted in a time and context beyond the experience of the Holocaust. In consequence, the history of Matzpen ends with the fall of the Jewish utopian views on a common Arab-Jewish future in the Middle East. While Lutz has emphasized the role of a specific Jewish and Israeli experience in the history of Matzpen, I aim to locate the group within a broader context of the history of the New Left. Why? I want to argue that the particular case of the Israeli New Left might well have been a marginal phenomenon. However, it also sheds light on the general dilemmas of New Left politics. I would like to draw attention to one aspect which is common to both the Israeli and the European left, and which contains the apparatus of New Left politics in Nietzsche, the relation to the state. At the beginning of the New Left's history, we find the search for political spaces beyond the Communist Party and the political institutions of the state. The question concerns the boundaries of this political space. Who belongs to it? Who makes politics? Only the parties and trade unions? Do other modes of political practice beyond institutionalized politics exist? In Israel, Matzpen understood the Palestinian population for the first time as a political factor, and related to that, they subverted the official national version of the Israel state's history. With their vision of a socialist Middle East, they reinvented Israeli existence beyond the Zionist state. However, the question of the boundaries of the political space aims to go beyond the state, and is nevertheless inseparably linked to it. In Europe, the New Left aimed to widen the political space and to reappropriate public space through the strategy of occupation with teach-ins and sit-ins. But a protest movement, cannot be maintained in the long term. This is one of the aporias of New Left politics. However, the boundaries of the political space can also be those of a nation-state. And then the term occupation, Besatzung, Besetzung, Occupation, gets a whole new meaning. In Israel, the boundaries of the political space were closely linked to the nation-state, and the majority of the people perceived the existing state already as a realization of an utopian idealism. Looking from today, it seems as if in Israel the state held not only the symbolic monopoly on politics, but as a Zionist state, it also held the monopoly on idealism. I come to my second point. The history of Matzpen as a perspective on the '68 movement from the margins. The protest events of the late 1960s and their alternative, feminist, ecological, and violent aftermath have led to a mythologization of the emblematic year 1968. The commemorative obsession with dates has led to the fact that the Israeli case has gone mostly unobserved. Indeed, there was no May '68 in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv. But the history of the New Left is not limited to one mythical year. And the history of the Israeli New Left does not start with the reception and the success of Matzpen within the European left or American left. The history of Matzpen, as presented by Lutz, provides a broader view on the general history of the '60s protest movements, and thus in various aspects. First, on a chronological level. The study on Matzpen stands for a recent tendency in the historiography of the New Left, namely of switching the perspectives. It turns less towards the supposed social consequences and the afterlives of the New Left politics. Instead, it reconstructs the intellectual heritage of the activists, the Vorgeschichte, and locates it within a wider historical context in a kind of longue durée. Without neglecting the role of watershed events and dates, Lutz's study also avoids the generational paradigm which characterizes the perception of the European '68 movements. However, this paradigm of a '68 generation is apparently so powerful that Israeli historiography invented the '67 generation in order to inscribe itself to the master narrative of an international '60s generation. My second point is on the geographical level. The study on Matzpen helps to provide a more global perspective on the protest movements driven by the New Left of the '60s. And finally, thematically, the study not only adds an important part to the history of utopian thinking, moreover, it brings back in the political to a perception of '68 which has been mostly culturalized. I come to my third and last point, a German view on Matzpen, a view from the margins. From its contribution to the recent historiography of protest and dissidence in the '60s, I want to come to my third point, to sociologically spoken, the objectivation of the one who is objectifying. Lutz is not the first to write on the history of Matzpen, but he is the first to do so as a double outsider. He was never a member of Matzpen, and secondly, as far as I know, and secondly, he's not an Israeli scholar. He wrote his book at the prestigious Simon Dubnow Institute in Leipzig, which dedicates its work to Jewish history and culture. With his interest in Matzpen, he chose a research topic which demands not only a great understanding and sensitivity for questions of Israeli and Jewish history, but also, as a basic tool, the knowledge of Hebrew. Here I want to express my great admiration for taking on this task. Moreover, he has historicized an important part of the Israeli history which had been marginalized. When it comes to controversial recent historical phenomena, the researcher's look from the outside is challenged by the actual historical agents and their personal memories. Who has the legitimacy to interpret a political group's past? Who manages the past of a heterogenic protest movement? Its Orthodox members, its heretics, the men, the women? In the case of the European protest movements of the 1960s, the former activists have been fighting over their past for almost 50 years. In the course of the years, one dominant historical interpretation has imposed itself. The protest movements of the 60s were a political failure in the sense that they did not lead to a different institutional political order. At the same time, they were credited for bringing up cultural successes, for instance, the change in gender relations, the ecological and feminist movement. And here, of course, the definition of political and cultural is to debate. I recall this interpretation of the European 68 movements because it marks the political discourse in Europe as well as the evaluation of contemporary protest movements until today. While the interpretation battles on the Western protest movements of the 1960s have turned the actual events into a kind of generational upheaval and the breakthrough of a mass and counterculture, the history of the Israeli left still touches upon the basics of the Israeli society. However, the almost unanimous condemnation of Matzpen as traitors of the Zionist state has averted a broader historical controversy on its meaning. In the introduction to his book, Lutz argues a process of depolitization was necessary in order to historicize and contextualize Matzpen. In contrast, I would argue that it probably needed the outsider's view on Matzpen. The book on Matzpen, and I hope it will find its way to an Israeli publishing house, might initiate a wider-ranging debate. And with this idea of a beginning, I want to come to the end of my commentary. I take a scene from the book. I want to conclude with the most famous activist of the New Left, Cohn-Bendit. The story of Matzpen, as presented by Lutz in his book, begins with the icon of the French May 68, sitting on a rooftop in the kibbutz Gan Shmuel during his visit in Israel in 1970. During his visit, Cohn-Bendit said, and I quote, in 30 to 40 years, the Matzpen group will be very important as a role model for the politicized youth who deals with the questions of Israel, end of quote. Today, almost 35 years after the end of Matzpen, what are its legacies? To what extent does it play a role for the Israeli left today? Does it play a role at all? How are we to deal today, after the proclaimed death of utopian thinking, with the way Matzpen framed the Palestinian question in the 60s? Toda rabba.